Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, panel discussion, which is hosted by University of Cambridge Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Centre. I'm delighted that we have a excellent panel with us here this evening to talk about ultra-processed foods. Before we start, I have just one or two things to say about the process. As you'll see, audience members' microphones and cameras are muted throughout. We are expecting quite a large audience. However, you will be given the opportunity to ask questions of the panel, and we ask you to put those into the Q&A function, which you can find in your Zoom menu. You can put these in at any time throughout the webinar, and we will choose a number of questions to ask the panel towards the end of the panel discussion. We may not be able to answer all the questions that are put into the Q&A function, but we'll do our best. I'd ask you please to note that this event is being recorded and will be available to view afterwards. And I think that is everything by way of announcements. So let me just move on to the discussion. Oh, just one other thing to mention. Our speakers have, and myself have made declarations of interest, and those available on our website, the QR code for which you can see on the screen at the moment. You can also see more information about the speakers' biographies there. So a few words of introduction from me before we get going with the questions. Calorie-dense foods, often high in fat, salt and sugar, are overconsumed at a population level and are known to be linked to the global rise of unhealthy diets, obesity and a range of non-communicable diseases. Around 60% of such foods are also said to be ultra-processed. But what does this mean? Are UPFs simply calorie-dense foods, or are they somehow uniquely bad for our health? And what should we do about them? This topic has become hotly debated in the media, as well as in scientific circles, and is increasingly surfacing on policy agendas worldwide. So I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panel today to discuss this topic. Dr. Yanaina Chavez-Ugalde is a postdoctoral researcher at the Centre for Food Policy at City St George's University of London. Yanaina did her PhD at Bristol University, exploring the commercial determinants of dietary behaviour associated with obesity in adolescents, and then a postdoctoral post at the MRC Epidemiology unit here in Cambridge, where she extended her research on ultra-processed foods. Baroness Joan Walmsley is a Liberal Democrat peer in the House of Lords. She recently chaired the House of Lords Committee on Food, Diet and Obesity, whose report, Recipe for Health, A Plan to Fix Our Broken Food System, was published a month ago and received its parliamentary launch last week. The committee's remit was to consider the role of foods such as ultra-processed foods and foods high in salt, fat and sugar in a healthy diet and tackling obesity. The report undertook a detailed examination of the evidence on UPFs and health. Dr. Chris van Tulleken's research focuses on human nutrition and commercial determinants of health, working with the WHO and UNICEF in this area. He's also well known as a television presenter who, along with his brother Zand, launched the long-running and hilarious children's TV show Operation Ouch. Chris trained in medicine at Oxford and did a PhD at University College London in molecular virology. He remained an associate professor at UCL and a clinical infectious disease doctorate at University College Hospital and the Hospital for Tropical Diseases. He's most recently leapt back into public consciousness with his best-selling book, Ultra-Processed People: Why Do We All Eat Stuff That Isn't Food, and Why Can't We Stop? Last but not least, Dr. Srai is Director of the Institute for Manufacturing in Cambridge and co-chairs the Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Centre, which is hosting today's event. Jag is an internationally renowned expert in supply chains. In the past, he's worked with a wide range of industries to understand their processes and support innovation and efficiency. He's also worked in senior executive and technical director roles in a number of multinational companies, including the food industry. You are all very welcome. We have an hour for this discussion. However, we will reserve a little for questions towards the end, as I said. And just to remind audience members, please put your questions in the Q&A function. So to start with, I'd like to ask by asking, what is a UPF? Perhaps we can start with you, Yanaina.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin, and welcome everybody. So ultra-processed food is a concept that tries to capture the extent and purpose of processing in ready-to-eat industrial products. Now, in 2009, Professor Carlos Monteiro and his team in Brazil developed a food classification system, which is an academic tool, basically, to capture the nutrition transition and the increasing obesity rates in Brazil. NOVA, it is not just a food level classification system, but it also enables us to explore dietary patterns. NOVA is not an acronym, actually, and in the words of Professor Monteiro, it alludes to a supernova and invites us to think about the food system in a different light. Although it is not the only classification system trying to identify ultra-processed foods, it is the only one that is recognized by FAO, UNICEF, and WHO as one of the most suitable metrics to monitor healthy diets worldwide. Now, NOVA has 4 food groups: unprocessed or minimally processed foods, culinary processed ingredients, processed foods, and ultra-processed foods. Now, of the matter of today, ultra-processed food, what is it based on the NOVA definition? Well, an ultra-processed food is an industrial formulation which is basically based on chemically modified parts of food. It usually has a lot of additives. It has little, if any, whole foods remaining. It has ingredients that you cannot buy on a common supermarket and that probably your grandma or great grandma wouldn't recognize. And the purpose, this is important, the purpose of ultra processing is that it creates convenient, tasteful, highly profitable, and relatively affordable products that they displace other NOVA groups like minimally processed foods. So to give you an example, an unprocessed food is corn on the cob as you find it in nature. A culinary processed ingredient is corn oil. A processed food is canned corn. And an ultra-processed food is Doritos. So it's based in corn, but it's not very far away from how we find it in nature. And in my view, having done a PhD in the commercial determinants of diet and obesity, I see ultra-processed food, the concept, as a perfect case study to understand how big food corporations and their profit-making activities are operationalized at the expense of public health.
Great, thanks, Janine. That's really helpful. So, Chris, why do we eat so many ultra-processed foods?
Well, there's a very sophisticated part of that 9-paragraph definition that Yanaina so elegantly distilled, which is that the purpose of the processing is important. So originally the purpose of food was broadly to nourish our friends, our family, build our community. And with the industrialization of diet, we saw a shift in purpose where the purpose of food became to make money and make money for institutional investors. So we can use the food corporation's financial data to demonstrate, and this has been done, analysis led by Ben Wood, who I'm sure many of you on the call know Ben and his work. He used the financial data from the food system to demonstrate the obligations to institutional investors, that the primary incentives within the system are financial, despite there are quite grandiose claims by a lot of the companies that they are concerned for plastic pollution, carbon emissions, improving child labor conditions, and especially public health. And we can demonstrate that that isn't the case. And so the way I think about it is that every single product you buy that's a completed product ready to eat or quick to prepare by industry has thousands of properties. It has ratios of particular ingredients, it has flavor and taste profiles, it has texture, pH, and then of course it has packaging and marketing surrounded it. Every single property of every single product has been optimized to maximize either profit or consumption, or usually both. And so you can't point to any one aspect of the food and say that is why you are eating too much of it. It's the gestalt of the product that drives the excessive consumption. That said, I think we do understand a few of the properties that lead to excess consumption. Some of this is very old science. We know that UPF is high in sugar. We know it has salt, sugar, fat profiles that are hyperpalatable, and that drives excessive consumption. We know that it's soft and energy dense for lots of reasons, and soft, energy dense products are consumed very rapidly. But I do think the system of development is what is important. And so I've interviewed a huge number of people in the food industry who testify on the record that when they develop products, they put them through focus groups. And the thing they're really interested in measuring is how much food do people eat and how quickly do they eat it. And those are the products that make their way onto the shelf. We know at some companies they use MRI scanners to develop the food. So if you're struggling eating this food or controlling your intake, it is worth considering the geniuses that have optimized all of this over many, many decades to make it very hard to stop eating.
Chris, that's really helpful. Thank you. Jag, I'd like to bring you in now. What are your thoughts from an industrial perspective on the value or benefits of UPFs to societies? I'm not trying to say, UPFs are a good thing, but clearly, as Chris said, they've developed within a context in which, an economic context in which it's entirely acceptable to generate profits and growth.
Yeah, it is indeed a bit of a loaded question, Martin, and I think this makes a good discussion, of course. And I guess, yes, UPFs are in the dock from some of the harmful health effects, and it's great that Chris and others are identifying some of those issues. But maybe that from an industrial perspective, I'm looking at the manufacturing supply chain rather than product design, and maybe answer some of the questions as to why, for example, in the UK and the US, it's starting to push beyond half the energy intake we have, for example. So, I mean, they are convenient. Yeah. So convenience is absolutely driving some of the kind of consumption. A lot of the work I do in other sectors, as well as the agri sector and food sector, is many products are perishable. So shelf life and accessibility become, very relevant issues to ensure that food is actually safe to eat on the day it arrives in somebody's hands. So that's a key a challenge by manufacturing supply chain managers think about. Of course, some would claim that there are ingredients that are included that actually support, for example, nutrient fortification and other aspects too. So that can also be an angle. But from a demand perspective, I guess convenience, shelf life, accessibility, affordability, because of pretty much every industrial process is, as you would expect, optimized for removal of waste, maximizing transport and logistics, etc. And you would expect that on pretty much any manufactured product across any sector. And of course, that professionalism will reduce the cost and therefore make it more affordable. But we also see other areas where it can have some benefits in terms of portion control. It can have, for example, in emergency food supplies, where there are many situations where having fresh produce is not easily an option. That professionalism also gives us consistency of the product in terms of quality, very rigorous quality testing that product is safe to eat. Many of us will have had problems in restaurants and so on and so forth. Pretty much manufactured goods you would be very surprised to have a health issue and so on. So, and finally, I mean, as a vegetarian, lacto-vegetarian myself, the food available is often limiting, and there is innovation in dietary options too. So, again, we must take into account some of the harmful effects that Chris has raised and others. But these are some of the reasons of why they've become popular and why demand has indeed increased.
Great, thanks, Jag. That's really helpful. Okay, so let's move on and talk about why we should be concerned about UPFs. Yanaina, can I come back to you for this? What does the epidemiology tell us?
Of course, and there's an important point to be made there, that there's processed food which hasn't been linked to ill health, and then there's ultra processed food that has been linked. So I'm going to focus on ultra processed food, and there's an accumulating body of evidence that a high consumption of ultra processed food is associated with adverse health outcomes. A recent review that include 45 pooled study analyses and about 10 million people found very convincing evidence of the association between ultra-processed food consumption and type 2 diabetes, adverse sleep, anxiety, common mental health disorders, cardiovascular disease mortality, and suggestive evidence with risk for obesity, all-cause mortality, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, depression, and wheezing. And a bit of the criticism around this is that there's very limited evidence on the causality. And I believe Kevin Hall is in the call today, and it's one randomized controlled trial, he's the author, that found that over a 2-week period, an ultra-processed food diet led to an extra 500 calories per day more and 2-pound weight gain over the 2 weeks. Now, although we only have that one randomized control trial and many on the go, their vast amount of evidence is basically observational and not causal. The bulk of the evidence points towards that having a diet based in ultra-processed food can harm health. And I think that's where we should be focusing. And furthermore, it shows that there's vast differences in consumption, and that vulnerable populations like children and people from lower socioeconomic groups are at increased risk because they value those in different ways, and they sometimes depend on these foods. So the question is, why or how did we end up in the over-reliance on ultra-processed food?
Thanks, Janina. So, Chris, what does the epidemiology not tell us? What other science is there that we should know about on, for example, formulation, advertising, marketing, and so on?
I think there are two questions of interest here. One is whether or not we're sure that ultra-processed food causes health harms. And the other is, are we sure that ultra-processed food isn't just another fancy name for high-fat, salt, sugar food? So in terms of the evidence beyond the epidemiology, whenever we look at epidemiological evidence, we say, does it meet formal criteria to judge whether or not there is causality? So we wrap the epidemiology with other science. And we have to say, is there a strong association with certain negative health outcomes? Yes, there is. And the other thing I want to say here, actually, I should have prefaced this, is we're talking about a dietary pattern, okay? Pointing at individual products is a more complicated thing. So when I say ultra-processed food, I mean a dietary pattern high in ultra-processed food. We see a strong association. We see temporal associations. We've got prospective studies. We look at biological gradients, dose-response relationships, and again, that's very consistent. The evidence around ultra-processed food is coherent with existing knowledge on dietary quality. So we've got very good consensus agreements on, not always built on the best evidence, but we all broadly agree about whole and minimally processed foods, what a good diet looks like. And it's not like an ultra-processed diet. And then we have experimental evidence. So Yanaina said there's Kevin's excellent RCT. There's another replication of that, a Japanese study published another RCT showing very much the same thing. But we also have many randomized control trials and experimental clinical studies from humans and from animals, looking at properties either common to or unique to ultra-processed food. And that's, if we look at the salt, sugar, fat profiles, the energy density, softness, the evidence around marketing. So there's a lot of data that I think we have satisfied the criteria for causality to say a dietary pattern high in ultra-processed food does cause negative health outcomes.
Thanks, Chris. So I'd like to bring Joan in now, if that's okay. In the House of Lords Committee inquiry, you heard from and received evidence from many, many witnesses from all different sectors. What sorts of things did they say about UPFs and the industry that produces them?
Yes, indeed, we did, Martin. That's true. We had a massive amount of evidence, both oral evidence and also written evidence. About 150 pieces of written evidence. And you've got to bear in mind that our study was not just about ultra-processed foods, it was about the whole diet. We heard from people like we heard from Chris, and we heard from a whole lot of people who have particular concerns about ultra-processed food. And what became very clear is there's an awful lot of it about. The FSA does a regular study of people's attitudes to foods, and they found that ultra-processed foods was in the top 3 of the public's concerns about food ever since the middle of 2023, and rising, and a very high proportion of people are concerned about it. The question then arose is, what is it? And we heard from Professor Montero and various other people about the various kinds of classifications, and including Chris's wrapped in plastic and contains things that you don't find in your kitchen. And some food industry people told us that you can't do anything about UPF because the public are confused about it. Well, we didn't believe that, actually, because we had evidence, for example, from the Food and Farming Citizens Commission, from the Food Foundation, from Bite Back, from lots and lots of people that are very, very clear about whether ultra-processed foods, individual foods, fall into one or other classification of those foods of concern. We also heard about the quantity of those foods that make up the dietary pattern of a lot of people, particularly young people and people on low incomes. And we heard from Professor Franco Sassi of all food products, the ones that have come down the most in terms of price per calorie are ultra-processed foods. So it wasn't surprising then that some of the people on low incomes with lived experience of having difficulty feeding their families healthy food told us that, yes, their diets consisted a lot of ultra-processed foods because they're cheap and they can't afford more healthy foods. And analyses also show that people on the lowest incomes would have to spend more than 50% of their income if they were to get a diet that fulfills the national dietary guidelines. So we're also concerned about the amount of ultra-processed foods provided to children in school meals, for example, and ultra-processed foods sold as food for toddlers and very, very young children. So there was a great deal of evidence that it is something that we needed to look at. We heard from industry just a bit. Most of the big industry players that we asked to come and talk to us refused to do so, or simply didn't answer our requests. But we did have 4 quite big industry players who told us that what they really want is a level playing field. So whatever we might recommend, that it should apply right across the whole food industry. And we also heard that it's perfectly possible to provide a ready meal which is safe and healthy and doesn't use any ultra-processed foods and still make a profit. So I think that's the sort of range of evidence that we heard.
One of the things that really struck me in the evidence was the testimony from young people from the Bite Back group. Could you just give the audience just a flavour of some of the things they said?
Yes, indeed. I mean, Chris just talked about advertising and promotion, and the young people really focused on that. They really begged us to protect them from the deluge of advertising of ultra-processed foods and unhealthy foods in general. And of course, it's not surprising because I think, as Chris has often said, and as we know, the reason these foods are cheap is that they're mass produced in factories from rather basic ingredients with a few flavorings very carefully put together to make the food tasty, added to them. And there's a very big profit margin, which means that these companies can spend a massive amount of money advertising and promoting those foods. And add that together with the price, and it's hardly surprising that people buy a lot of them. We also looked at previous policies about obesity, and we found that it's your own research, actually, Martin, that showed that they'd mostly really failed because they were focused on personal decision making. And the problem with that is that they're swimming against a tide of advertising and affordability and accessibility. And, it really isn't helpful when people are swimming against the tide to ask them to swim harder. People can't, because it's all they can afford in many cases. There's a lot of people in this country, they do 2 or 3 jobs, they work terribly hard, they come home in the evening, absolutely exhausted, very little time, the kids want eating. They can't afford to buy the ingredients to cook from scratch. They can't afford the energy, the gas or electricity. So what do? They take some food out of the freezer and stick it in the microwave, which uses very little energy, and feed the children with that. And many of those meals are, in fact, ultra-processed. But what we heard, which I thought was very interesting, was that it doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thank you very much. So one other thing I wanted to ask you, Joan, was about whether there were areas of contention over UPFs in the committee. And how you reached a consensus. What conclusions did you reach? Could you just say a little bit about that?
Yes. Certainly we heard about the epidemiological evidence that Chris has talked about, and there clearly is a tremendous amount of it. And I think Chris was quite right in talking about the dietary pattern. And what we did hear from witnesses, that because there is some confusion about whether an individual food falls into NOVA category 3 or 4, it's really very difficult to call any individual food conclusively as a category 4 ultra-processed food, and that makes it difficult to decide on any particular policy. And so a lot of people said to us, well, what we need is causality. We need to know exactly what it is about these foods that are causing this correlation with dietary risks, diet-related health risks. The trouble is, it occurred to me that diet is such a complicated thing, and each individual food is a very complicated thing. As Chris has just said, it has all kinds of different characteristics, that we can do research, of course, about causality, about particular characteristics of foods, such as energy density, such as palatability, such as obviously the nutrients in foods. But in the end, because diet is so complex, you're never going to get one particular causation identified. So you have to go on the observed evidence, on the correlation. we did, of course, hear from Dr. Kevin Hall about his random controlled trial, and I understand that there are more similar trials underway. He himself actually accepted that there were some aspects of that work that could be criticised. But what was very clear was his conclusion to us in the end was that part of the problem was hyperpalatability, and another part of the problem was a calorie density and the fact that food goes down very, very quickly. But we also heard from others that one of the difficulties is if you eat a lot of these foods which are probably HFSS, probably high in calories, probably very palatable, they push out of the diet whole foods that contain fiber, contain micronutrients that might be very, very important in people's diets. Of course, there's also the aspect of additives. And, we heard that some additives have been used for many, many years to preserve food, like salt, for example. But the FSA, of course, gave us evidence, and all of these additives have been licensed in food to be sold in the UK as individual additives. But not much work has been done on combinations of additives. And we were also a bit concerned about the level of dose of particular additives that people who have a very high percentage of UPF in their diet are actually taking in every day. And so the long-term effects of high quantities of certain additives could very well be having an effect on diet-related health risks.
Thanks. So your conclusions overall at the end of the day essentially said that you're unable to suggest that UPFs should be regulated directly at this stage because of the lack of causal evidence. But that there was huge,
that's right.
But there was huge scope to regulate UPFs by focusing on high-fat salt sugar foods, for example.
That's right. We heard about the very high overlap, 60 to 80% actually, depending how you look at it, between HFSS foods and ultra-processed foods. So we concluded, first of all, that if we put measures to government, and if the government accepts them, to dissuade people from eating such a high percentage of HFSS foods in their diet, then at the same time you are actually tackling the UPF consumption as well. However, we also felt that it's quite important to recommend that a whole lot more research is done about causality, and that this should be independent of the food industry. This should be funded independently and not by the food industry, so that it could be trusted by everybody. The third thing, however, we did feel was justified, despite all the discussion and disagreement that we heard, is that the national dietary guidelines should be looked at, and that those who put those guidelines together should consider whether they should be advising people that a high percentage of ultra-processed foods in their dietary pattern is probably going to put them at risk of diet-related diseases. So that was as far as we felt we could go. And we heard even people like Chris actually told us that he didn't feel that you could use the NOVA classification, or really any other classification about ultra-processed food, to actually regulate any individual food. It really is all about the dietary pattern.
Joan, thanks very much. That's hugely helpful. Chris, I'm going to come to you for a follow-up on this. How do you feel about the recommendations of the report, and would you like to have seen them go further, or where would you like to see regulation go in the future on ultra-processed foods?
Well, I would have liked, but I thought the report was great and I was honoured to contribute to it. I would have liked it to go further. I'm a little puzzled about the mechanism hesitancy. So there is a huge amount we don't know about this. The industry, we know Unilever and Pepsi paid neuroscientists to put people in MRI scanners to develop products. So we don't have access to a lot of the data that was generated, but we do have really established nutritional dogma around properties of food that are to do with processing, the softness, ratios of salt, fat, sugar, which aren't the same as absolute levels. Ratios are processing, marketing, and so on. So I feel like we have a lot of mechanistic data. So I'm always puzzled when people are hesitant on that. I think what I said about ultra processed food that Joan's absolutely right about is not that the definition doesn't have enormous value for research. It obviously has value for research. Dozens, possibly hundreds of excellent research groups have produced large numbers of studies using the definition. The problem for legislation is twofold. First of all, it's not that it's imprecise. It works well in a research setting. It's that it won't withstand food industry legislation. So if you have a product with xanthan gum in it, you would say, well, in a research study, that's obviously an industrial additive. The food industry could say in legal action that this is an additive that patients with celiac disease use for domestic cooking. It's not an industrial additive. So that's one of the problems. The other is it has a large loophole. The food industry say very often that the definition of UPF is too broad. It includes a lot of actually foods that are quite healthy, supermarket whole grain bread. The group I work with at UCL, I think Adrian Brown is on the call. We're doing an analysis, and this is unpublished, but far from being too wide a definition, it looks like the definition of UPF is too narrow. So there is no such thing, I would say, as nutritionally balanced UPF. It seems to almost all be excessive in calories, salt, saturated fat, and sugar. But there are products that are harmful that don't quite meet the UPF definition. So these would be the ready meals without additives and products like that. So they may not quite be UPF, but they still need regulation. So I think using the old methods, calories, saturated fat, salt, and sugar is great, but we need a much, much tighter definition than the current HFSS, which, maybe this is some fine print, but it by no means describes foods that are necessarily high in fat, salt, and sugar.
So I think the House of Lords Committee heard from a number of witnesses that a precautionary principle should be applied in the case of UPFs, given the epidemiological evidence. Is that something you would advocate, Chris?
We have some of the worst in the UK. We have some of the worst diet-related disease statistics in the world. We're in an emergency in the sense of we have to act now, but it's a chronic emergency in the sense we needed to act 20 or 30 years ago. 25%. The stats we're all numb to, aren't we? But 25% of children at the age of 10 live with obesity, and that goes hand in hand with hunger and stunting. So you say, what if it isn't if we don't call it ultra processed? Let's say it's industrially processed, packaged goods, excessive in energy, salt, fat, and sugar. We are doing almost nothing. The regulation is so light touch as to be invisible. My 7-year-old can go into any shop, buy any product. There is no clear warning even that sugary products will decay her teeth. So we need a revolutionary mindset, and we have masses of evidence about what to do. But it won't be one little thing. It has to be the tobacco control approach. The really important thing I want to say is the business model is predicated on harm. It must do harm. It's like the alcohol and tobacco industries. It is built on excessive consumption, and the products are almost all misaligned with dietary guidance. So, yes, we need rigorous regulation.
So, Yanaina, you've done a lot on the commercial determinants of health. Where do you stand on this debate?
I agree on all of this. And I think if we tip the coin and say a high consumption of UPFs is harmful, the other side of the coin is by having a high consumption of UPF, and by this I mean over 50% of the calories daily in adolescents is 66% of the daily calories of their intake. If we base that diet in that, the other side of the coin is that they are not consuming the minimally processed food that can be supportive for health. So we're all very immersed in UPF as a definition, as a classification, but UPF as a concept really highlights those power imbalances, the conflict of interest, and really the commercial determinants and the drivers of unhealthy diets. And I guess, how do we come to this? How can we put value of nutritious food at the forefront of a nation's priority? And in that way, we don't have to talk about UPFs, but, confronting or recommending a reduction in ultra processed food really confronts industry power. And that's kind of where we're facing that power imbalances from big profits at the expense of public health.
So one of the things in the House of Lords report was that they recommended both regulation of the industrial food system, but also encouraging the consumption of healthier foods, unprocessed, minimally processed foods. I think one of the key findings there was that the evidence base for that is a lot weaker. And the number of interventions that could be, for regulation of the food industry, you've got taxes, marketing regulation, a whole bunch of things. But for promoting the healthier parts of the food industry, there's very little that's been properly researched. But I think that's a really important point, absolutely. So listen, we're going to come to audience questions very shortly. So if you've got any more questions, please do put them in the chat now. Before we do that, I'm going to go to Jag for a last question. Turning to the future, Jag, given that governments are increasingly regulating unhealthy foods, even if not yet explicitly ultra-processed foods, where do you think the processed industry will go from here? How will it react to regulation, and what can we expect to see over the coming years?
Well, I think I agree with a lot of our panelists, but let me just put a little bit of context here. The industrial system or the manufacturing sector is one of the biggest sectors there is in terms of manufacturing supply chains. A lot of them will be involved in minimum processed foods, as well as the conversation of interest today is these ultra processed foods. So for me, what's looking ahead, I think, first of all, trying to understand interventions that change the food supply chain that we have today, I think is on everybody's agenda, including industrial partners. So I think, badging them as the problem here is a mistake. I think we need them in the tent, and I think they're producing some fantastic minimally processed foods. But what can we do about this particular part of the activity, the segment? So first of all, I think collaboration, pre-competitive collaboration, I've seen in many sectors where regulators, government, industry, and academia work together to design interventions. Now, we can think of something I've been learning from this conversation today. It's not about the product, it's about the dietary pattern. So that obviously has a much broader context, and that's why we need a broader approach. But there could be reformulation of products, there could be transparent labeling, healthier alternatives being encouraged, certainly responsible marketing. But participation of health organizations and regulators will be, I think, fundamental, as well as some broader issues around education. I mean, I saw one of the comments in the chat from Russell, I think, about what if we had shorter supply chains? That's the direction of travel at the moment. And does that allow us to have more ingredients locally? We see the the level of importation of foodstuffs in the UK. I think that's extremely high and certainly doesn't feel like the right balance. And it really leads on to me just closing off here, Martin, which is just been awarded a new research project. I can't name it at the moment, but we're talking about exploring these alternative scenarios, shorter supply chains, for example, understanding what interventions might drive that and how to, from a research basis, funded by government, not by industry, analyze the likely impacts. So I think that's the way to go. It's a collaborative pathway to getting to a better food system.
So, Jag, just picking up on something you said there, which I know exercised the House of Lords Committee a lot, and Chris a lot in his book. Is it possible to work with the food industry and the ultra-processed food industry in particular as a researcher and avoid the kind of problem of conflicts of interest? Won't the food industry just, as it were, kind of lead you up the garden path in terms of doing research or encouraging you to do research that would achieve the outcomes that are best for their business?
Well, I think Chris made a great point about there's very smart people in the industry, but there's very smart academics, there's very smart regulators. So we will not have the wool pulled over our eyes. But I also challenge a little bit of the mood music here, that's their agenda. This shirt has been maximized for profit. This watch has been, the phone I'm carrying. So this idea of a dark profit maximization industry, I don't buy it. Now, that said, I agree with a lot of the points that have been made about, on this call. So I think working collaboratively makes sense, and it's something we are able to do. And we should be very careful that we make that absolutely transparent on how we do the research.
Great, thanks, Jay. So listen, we're going to go to questions now, and I'm not going to by any means be able to ask all the questions in the next 15 minutes, but let's get through them as quickly as we can. Someone called Rooney, whose full name I don't know, asks, what is the most effective way to discourage or even stop our loved ones from eating a UPF-based diet? Chris, maybe you could tackle this one. What's the most effective way to discourage or even stop our loved ones from consuming a UPF diet?
Probably to say absolutely nothing about it at all. One of the biggest harms to people who live with diet-related disease is not so much from the physiology of excess weight, although we know that does cause harm. It's from the stigma generated by society in general, but particularly the medical profession. We have data that they get worse treatment. And I think baked into this conversation, I think we are all saying part of what determines what people eat is the pricing, the availability, the affordability, the food environment. You breathe the air you breathe, not because you choose to, but because it's what's around you. And people have far less control, many people in this country, the most disadvantaged than people think. So I have made it my practice in all of my broadcasting and writing about this, never ever to tell anyone not to eat UPF. What I think we should all be asking for is not to ban UPF, it's to have a food system that is not, catastrophically eroding environmental capital and destroying public health and, as a result, the economy. So we want justice and equality in our food system. That, I think, will inevitably lead to less UPF, but that shouldn't be the goal.
Joan, do come in.
I'd like to add something to that, actually. And one thing you can do, I think, is to try and ensure that children's taste preferences, which are set very, very early in life, are to like foods that are good for them. And that's why I'm very worried about some of the foods that are advertised and promoted for very young children have a large amount of sugar in them. And that means that, very young children get that taste preference for sugar from a very early age, and it's very difficult to get rid of it. So there are lots of initiatives to help young children try different foods and hopefully eventually get to like them.
Great, thanks, Joan. Our next question is from Professor Kevin Hall from the US. Nice to have you here, Kevin. He's asking essentially whether it's possible to have a dietary pattern that is both healthy and high in UPFs. Yanaina, what's your view on that?
Oh, we come back to the classifications and what's UPF. Well, some research has suggested that you can actually have a categorized UPF dietary pattern and fit into dietary guidelines. However, even when fitting into dietary guidelines, it's still linked to ill health. So the question is, yes, you can, but what is a healthy UPF? And from some research doing a replacement analyses, what is a healthy UPF? I think we know that at population level, we do not eat enough fiber overall. And we can have fiber from minimally processed foods and sometimes from ultra processed food breads, which is a huge contention in the UK. So I'd say rather than looking for healthy UPFs, which are high in fiber, look for foods that are non-UPF, that are high in fiber by nature. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because clearly a lot of UPFs could be made healthier, i.e. you could reduce their calorie density, you could make them more nutritious, you could make them have for more fiber and so on. But you do sort of get to a point where you think, well, why not eat the non-UPF alternative or equivalent of that food? So Chris, come in on that, Chris.
I would say the part of, and this is slightly in response to Jag's point. We know how to make UPF healthy. It's relatively easily done. I mean, Kevin would be an excellent person to design and build healthy UPF. The problem is it has to survive in the marketplace. So Jag proposed collaboration and working with industry. My response to that would be industry knows how to make healthy ultra-processed food extremely well. They have far more knowledge about this than certainly than me. The fact that they don't do it tells us that they can't do it and compete in the marketplace, and that we have had collaboration at the highest levels of policy for 30 years, deliberate government partnership around obesity and food policy, partnership with all the regulators, the charities that talk about food, the Science Media Center. The food industry has total capture of everyone who might regulate them. And I know this because I get offered loads of money. And during that time, we've seen an explosion of diet-related disease. What the tobacco story tells us is that you need regulatory independence. Now, that doesn't mean never speak to industry. You've got to speak to industry. You've got to understand them. But you cannot have financial conflicts of interest with the people writing the policy and developing the policy and the would-be regulators. So I think it is industry could make healthy UPF, but the fact they don't tells us it won't survive in the marketplace.
Great. So Joan wants to come in, and then Jag, and then Yanaina. So Joan first.
Well, I quite agree with Chris there, and that's why we concluded that we've got to have mandatory regulation, and it's got to apply right across the food industry. And then you've got a level playing field. You've got to change some of the incentives of the food industry. You've got to make it necessary for them to report on the healthiness of their portfolio of products, and then approach targets that are healthier. And then somebody needs to regulate that and report back to Parliament about it. So that's the sort of approach that we came out with in our report.
Jag.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. So I think just as earlier we talked about focusing on a single product doesn't help. I think single organization equally. I think it has to be sector wide. It has to be sector wide collaboration. I believe in a strong regulation, but informed by discussion. I don't know of any regulators being handed lots of money by industry. So my way forward is really an informed discussion, a sector-wide move, and we incentivize innovation in healthy food, whether it's UPFs or whether it's minimally processed. And if we create the innovation ecosystem that drives that, I think industry will be up for it, because that's our evidence from other sectors.
Yanaina, you had a comment as well, I think.
I think reformulation is risky. It can work to a certain extent and making UPFs or whatever food healthier, but it can legitimize processing of foods and political leverage to delay regulation, if that's the only regulation. So Doritos, for example, have changed the entire processing line to change and tweak whatever ingredient level of fat, sugar, salt throughout the entire process to make it fit within the regulations that have high fat, sugar, and salt. So it has to be a staggered approach of many policies working together, and reformulation alone will definitely not tick the balance towards where we want to.
So an issue which has come up a little bit in the questions relates to the kind of move towards plant-based foods. And I know a lot of people, there's a big rise in veganism and vegetarianism at the moment, and in some cases this is for environmental reasons. And so I'm going to maybe pick the question from Jacqueline Teresa da Silva, who asks, how does plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy fit into these discussions? They're designed to replace unprocessed foods, but are often framed as necessary for a transition onto sustainable food systems. So plant-based alternatives, what are your views on those? Yanaina, do you want to start on that?
Brilliant point. And I think from Michael Pollan's, what is a healthy diet? Eat mostly plants in moderation. Eat food, mostly plants, not too much. And I think the meat replacements have captured a lot of the public spending, and that's great. But meat replacement as industrially formed, I think, should be the way forward to a minimally processed diet. Like vapes were intendedly or designed to quit smoking, but as a process, as an approach. The thing is, if we stayed with the vapes, we see what's happening. If we stayed with the ultra processed food meat replacement, we have another array of unintended consequences. Yes, it's better for carbon footprint, or that's what the evidence is saying so far. We have to account for carbon footprint of the plastic and the level of processing. But carbon emissions from meat, animal meats, or animal-based proteins, that's another issue. But there's research emerging, and Jackie, I think you are a good expert on this. So yeah, it should be as a staggered approach to minimally processed food. Eat food, mainly plants, not too much.
Great, thank you. So another question, Jag, I think this is someone from your department, actually, Diana Kripko. Considering the growth of global population and urbanization, how will a food system for a non-UPF society look? What are the key technologies and innovations for moving towards a non-UPF diet, I think is the question.
I guess there is a challenge in terms of a growing population. One of the things we can't do is increase substantially the available land for growing crops, for example. So I think again, sometimes our views on improved efficiency and reducing waste, I think is a huge part of where the manufacturing supply chain experts are at. I think so my answer to that question is the industrialization is is not something to be afraid about. It's something to harness in the direction we want to. So that would be my take on. We do need to increase production because the population is growing. We need to minimize waste, and that requires technologies. It needs supply chains that are probably shorter, certainly more visible, certainly more transparent. And I think that allows us also to be more discerning on the food that we eat and the sources of materials that are used to produce the food that we eat. So I think a lot of the innovations in the digital technologies that give us that transparency can help support that. And increasingly, those supply chains are being made visible to many other broader stakeholders. So I think that's a pathway.
Joan, do come in.
Yes, I agree with a lot of what Jag said, particularly about the issue of food waste. But I don't agree with one thing, because he said you can't make more land to grow crops. Well, you can use more land to grow crops for human beings to eat if you don't use so much of your land to grow crops for cows and sheep to eat. And that is a really very inefficient way of providing protein for human beings. And that is an argument for vegetarianism and veganism. I have to say, I am not vegetarian, although I mostly eat plants. But that is an argument that I'm afraid was beyond the remit of my committee, and we couldn't look into it.
And so, as a vegetarian, I'm glad you made that point, Baroness.
So listen, we have about 1 minute left. I'm going to ask one more question, so some kind of quick answers here. This is from Professor Monique Ratz. Are we saying our main focus should be on food business model transformation, i.e. we need to move beyond a focus on profit to a focus on health and well-being? So this kind of evokes ideas of, donut economics and triple bottom line and so on. What are your thoughts on this? What will we need to do to achieve this? Jag, do you have any thoughts on this kind of move?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, from a supply chain perspective, having a resilient and sustainable supply chain is something that is fundamental to the way these should be designed. So I think sustainable from a number of perspectives, not just the energy and resources we consume, but that actually we're getting outcomes that society want. And I think those should be the principles in which future supply chains are designed to.
So listen, everyone, I'm afraid we are out of time, very much so. And I'm sorry that we haven't been able to answer all the questions. There's some more great questions in the Q&A that we haven't been able to get to. I'm going to finish by, I'm just going to share my screen first of all while I do this. So I'd like to start first of all by thanking all of our panelists for an incredibly engaging discussion about UPFs. And thank you to the Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Centre for hosting. I suspect the debate over UPFs will run for a very long time, and perhaps we can invite you all back in a few years to see where we've got to on that. For audience members, thank you so much for joining. There's a huge number of people here, especially at this time of day. We will be sending you a very brief feedback questionnaire by email tomorrow. I think it has 5 questions. It would be terribly grateful if you could complete that. And thank you very much for joining. On the screen is the QR code for the House of Lords report. In case anyone hasn't seen it yet, it's a great read. And just want to say thank you very much to everyone for participating. Thank you very much.